What family secret did you suspect in childhood, but weren't able to confirm until adulthood? Before we start with the first story, please hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Story 1. My dad was in jail for a few months when I was around 8 years old. I was told he was at work, and he couldn't call us because it was a really big project. I heard my mom talking about him being locked up and thought he got trapped in the vent somewhere. He did HVAC work. It made sense to me at the time, I guess. When he came back, it was like nothing changed. Turns out he was a drug dealer. Story 2. I thought I had a half-sibling that my parents refused to discuss. Based on my mother reading books about adopted children finding birth parents, and also she graduated a year later than her twin sister because of rheumatic fever. I wondered if it was romantic fever. My dad died in 2006. In 2009, my mother called to tell me that my father had another daughter, and she just made contact with my mother. It turns out my father abandoned a pregnant girlfriend before he met my mother. He did tell my mother about the sordid affair, but swore her to secrecy. So yes, I was right. Stunned to be right, but happy. My sister is my best friend now. Story 3. My nan had a daughter before she married my grandfather, and he made her adopt the child out. The child would have been about 3 years old by that time. My nan and grandfather got together by default. They were messing around with each other behind their partners' backs, and Nan got pregnant. Her partner left. His partner left. They were forced to marry each other. It was a marriage full of regrets, and Granddad eventually left her for another woman. She died with her first husband's photo in her wallet. By luck, I found his family, and it turned out that he also had her picture in his wallet when he died. Story 4. My grandpa was murdered by an uncle married to Mom's sister. He sexually abused my mother and her sisters. He died when I was 4. I have vague memories of him. Just after he died, my aunt divorced the uncle. At age 12, I overheard my other uncles, 2 were Mom's brothers, and 1 married Mom's baby sister, talking about a vow they had made to keep me from being a victim of Grandpa. At 16, I figured it out. The uncle that actually murdered him, a hero, was a jeweler and insulin-dependent diabetic. He used cyanide in jewelry making. Grandpa drank a 36-pack of beer every night. I suspected he injected cyanide into a random beer. My aunt saw Grandpa alive at 2 a.m. Uncle woke up at 5 a.m. and Grandpa was dead and stiff. His body was cremated and Uncle vanished. I mentioned my suspicions to my cousin, who relayed them to his father. 3 years ago, the uncle was dying. He reached out to me and told me I had actually figured out how Grandpa died. He waited until he was dying since there is no statute of limitations for murder. Story 5. Still can't confirm it, but my dad and aunt are not my grandfather's children. My grandparents got married in the late 1940s, and around that time, my grandmother took an awful lot of photos with a guy who would end up being a pretty popular politician in the 70s, with a very distinct facial feature that both my dad and aunt have. Turns out she was also seeing him sporadically in that time period, which she later admitted. As I said, we'll still never know. My grandma's husband died in 1960, and the man she had that affair with ended up passing in 2000s. Also, while in politics, he was known to get around, including having an open relationship with his first wife. So I don't think my dad and aunt are the only unknown children of his. Story 6. In my early teens, I had a sort of paranoia about my parents getting divorced. My mom was being treated for cancer and she died when I was almost 15. I always put it down to the general eerie uneasiness of those years, plus the fact that an awful lot of the YA books that I read at the time did feature divorce. 40 years later, my dad is in his 90s and he and I are hanging out, and he gets it off his chest that as soon as she realized her diagnosis had kiboshed our immigration to Canada, she began pushing him to take us kids anyway and just leave her behind. I couldn't do that, he said. I hope I was right. So I had caught a vibe. Story 7. My grandma gifted me and my twin brother a gray 1984 Buick Regal Limited when we turned 18. Plush bench seats with a velvety armrest. Many a Friday night spent cruising Riverside Californian boulevards, looking or action-blasting Cannibal Corpse on the blue backlit tape deck. One Saturday morning, while my dad was cleaning it out, he found an envelope jammed down beneath the well of the spare tire. The bulky ivory-colored business-size envelope contained a wad of $20 bills, $1,500 in total. Turns out my grandpa, before his Xmas Eve heart attack years before, was giving money to his sister who was in an abusive marriage and whom my grandma hated. At the same time, my grandparents' marriage was on the rocks. so he must have had to stealthily move funds around to help out his sister. Learned then that money would end up being an important chip in the marriage game. Story 8. This one hurts me. Both of my parents have been honest and truthful about their military service, just like my older brother and I both have, but my other brother is not. He did serve for more than a decade, however, he was an aircraft mechanic. He tells stories of combat, weapons training, and sometimes claims to have been in pararescue. He washed out of the pipeline for pararescue 2 weeks into basic training. I don't understand why he does that. To 99% of the population, it is super badass to say that you worked on military aircraft. Why embellish with lies? I just don't get it. We're all proud of him, so why does he have to do that? His daughter already thinks he's some kind of war hero or something. Story 9. When I was a kid, I always found my grandfather to be a complete He was a ground adult, religious conservative, with an inability to regulate his emotions. As a result, he often had these angry outbursts where he would just go off on these screaming rants unhinged. While he was never physically abusive, people had to walk on eggshells around him. At 8 years old, I wrote a letter to him asking him to be nicer, and he responded by screaming in my face. The dude was a complete He was a very bad person, and I was very happy when he died. Later on, it came out that he was a pedo as well and sexually molested my mother when she was a kid. I was definitely not surprised to hear that, so I am happy the dude is nothing more than a rotting corpse. He also had a very fast development of Alzheimer's in the last couple years of his life and degraded very quickly. I hope it was painful for him. Story 10. Growing up, I always suspected that my grandpa regretted divorcing my grandma and that there was a lot more to the story. They both seemed to still love each other, and when asked why they divorced, they both answer exactly the same. When we came to America, we kept arguing a lot, and it was better to get a divorce than to keep arguing. And all of his marriages afterwards ended in divorce due to things just not working out. Come to find out, my grandparents made it to America together, and then about 10 years later they divorced because my grandpa wanted to marry a younger woman. Wife number was an absolute disaster who ended up taking as much money as she could from grandpa, and then leaving him once she got her first husband to America. Wife number was a young woman who had a history of mental instability and eventually tried clearing all of his accounts and safes to go join a cult. He then divorced her afterwards. Story 11. My dad was cheating on my mom with that woman we met up with when we were looking at colleges in California. He was a headhunter and traveled a decent amount for work, generally to the West Coast because he did a lot of work for biotech firms. We went out there when I was in high school because I was interested in a few West Coast schools, UCSD, UCLA, Pepperdine, and he had a rugby tournament on Catalina Island with his old club. While we were out there, we met up with her for lunch one day in Louisiana. All I knew was she was one of the people he had placed with one of the companies that had hired him. While we had lunch, nobody did anything blatant like PDA or anything, but you could cut the tension with a knife. I knew something was off. Found out about the affair when my parents ultimately got divorced around a decade later. He basically dropped his whole history of infidelity on my mom to hurt her. She wasn't the only one either, just the only one my dad really had feelings for. He was a real piece of shit. Story 12. My oldest sister's death. I only knew she died as a baby and heard whisperings that a raccoon was involved. A cousin and I decided it was likely a rabid raccoon at a picnic or something. My parents only ever said she died in her sleep, so I also wondered if it was Sid's. Last year I decided to look up archived news articles online and found that my dad owned a pet raccoon for whatever reason. And when my sister was only 4 months old, they left to go to a party down the street and abandoned my sister in her crib and put the raccoon on a leash and looped it around a door handle just outside her room. When they got back from the party, completely drunk and high, they found the raccoon in her crib eating her fingers, lips, and nose. She was airlifted to the hospital and died on the way. There was a trial, but for some reason they were found innocent. They were quite negligent of me and my brother, so I'm not surprised by the story at all. As a mother myself, I was terrified of SIDS because there's evidence it runs in families. Also, I still had my daughter sleeping in her bassinet at my bedside at 4 months old. I couldn't even imagine sleeping in separate rooms at that age. There's no way I could leave the house for even 5 minutes, certainly not for several hours. Story 13. My grandmother had always acted weird around my dad. Things like weird looks if he was sarcastic or acted silly. She'd look at him like he was an alien. This was something I'd noticed all through growing up. The only time I'd ever seen reactions like that before was being over at a multiracial friend's place when they had older relatives, who would always look at the non-white parent the same way, like they weren't quite human. But I kept thinking that can't be it. Mom's white, dad's white, everyone in the family is white. Well, no, not quite. When I was part of the way through American history, I learned that, for a great deal of time, my Italian Catholic father, even though he's pale and freckled, was not quite white in the eyes of more waspy individuals. I kept telling myself, no, that's just stupid. I also didn't want to ask my parents, and definitely I didn't want to ask my grandmother what the deal was. Finally, in my mid-20s, I asked my mom, and she said, yes, that was exactly it. She'd never said an outright word to my dad about it, and he knew she'd always be too polite to say anything, and would mess with her. When my mom was pregnant with me, whenever my grandmother would ask what names they were considering, my dad would always answer with stuff like Giuseppe, just the most Italian names possible. She would always visibly flinch, but say, oh, that's nice. Story 14. My dad had a very bad relationship with his mother. I know she hit him as a child, but he had never been forthcoming about details. After my parents' divorce, my dad had a red pill phase where he just trashed women nonstop. Domestic violence laws were a particularly sore topic to him. Over time, I came to suspect that during their marital problems. My parents must have had an argument that turned physical, and it probably made him flash back to Joe traumatized he was when my grandmother would hit him. Mom would never say a word about it, and if you asked, she would change the topic, which further confirmed my certainty. Thankfully, my dad did eventually move on and get remarried. Last year, he finally confirmed that at one point my mom had slapped him. For as much anger as he had carried over it for years, now he shrugs it off like, long time ago, no big deal. Story 15. My aunt's dysfunctional arm wasn't from a fall. The doctor pulled her out from my grandmother's womb arm first. It dislocated her shoulder, and it wasn't fixed for long enough that one of her muscles atrophied. For some reason, I thought she'd fallen off a log when camping and it broke her arm. I think she did fall off a log and messed up something, but it didn't cause her arm problem. She had it rough. I knew she had a different dad from my mom and aunt, but I didn't know why. Turned out that my grandma and this guy had been caught having sex in the 1940s and were forced to marry. I didn't know why they divorced, but I assumed it was because of the forced marriage. I think now, and I'm still not certain, that he shook my aunt as a baby and my grandmother left him. The other family secret that I only discovered a few years ago is that the commune my parents were in the 1970s was more like a cult than a commune. There was one leader, everyone gave all their money to him, he set all the rules and made very arbitrary decisions. Like making my parents marry, even though, as my mom said, which sort of traumatized 14-year-old me, we weren't even sleeping together that week. Some seriously weird went down. It wasn't a commune, it was a cult. I asked my mom bluntly about it a few years ago and she agreed. Alright folks, that's a wrap. If you like this, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also share your those in the comment below.